Hello there, guys, and welcome back to a brand new episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. I hope that you guys are doing well. I hope you're staying safe as always. First of all, apologies for the delay in this episode. This was meant to go out on Friday. It's going out on Saturday instead, so hopefully that's not too much of an inconvenience for you guys. But of course, we're back to review the second part of the F1 2023 car launch special. And in this episode, we are going to be talking about the teams that broke cover on their 2023 challenges this week just gone. That's Aston Martin, McLaren, Ferrari, Mercedes, and of course Alpine, certainly not least but last in the order of reveals. And as we did in the previous episode where we did the other 5 teams, and of course you can check that episode out on your favourite podcasting platform or on the YouTube channel if you haven't already, we're going to be discussing what we thought of the launch, what we thought of the car. Do we like the look of it? Do we not like the look of it? Any trends that we're starting to see throughout the grid for the coming season? And of course, important issues that each individual team needs to address, in our opinion, for the coming season. Joining me on this episode, just the one and only Mr. Courtney Pine, but that is more than enough insight that we're going to need on this episode. Courtney, first of all, I know you've not been feeling the best, but how are you feeling this evening? You okay?
Yeah, I'm not doing too bad. Apologies if I feel a bit if I sound a bit muffly. Can't help it. I've been at war with a case of man flu. I also got myself into a fight with a chicken earlier on. I'm all scratched up, Adam. I've been in the wars, but I'm here. I'm in one piece, and I'm more than looking forward to going through some quite interesting launches because these are the teams, the 5 that we can look through. There's a lot of intrigue surrounding all 5 of them. So yeah, bring it on.
I think we probably should stress, for the benefit of any listeners tuning into this show that aren't familiar with your day job, Courtney, that obviously the incident with the chicken is not part of your day job, but one of the risks of your job working at the local farm. And it's not like you've just gone and found a random chicken and decided I'm
No,
going to
no,
have a fight with it.
no, I'm not a professional chicken fighter. I do chickens for me, it seems.
Fair enough. But yeah, as we said, guys, in this episode, we're going to be discussing the 5 teams that broke cover in the second week of car launch for 2023. And of course, if you want to support the channel, continue to do so. We really appreciate that. Subscribe to the YouTube channel and give us a 5-star review on your favorite pod platform. We are getting a few 5-star reviews, but they're all on Spotify. And as I said, whilst we are eternally grateful for your support, if you want to shout out, you need to let us know, because Spotify don't tell us who gives us 5-star reviews. It just adds an extra number to the many of you that have already been so kind with your support. So we really appreciate that. But of course, if you want to shout out for a 5-star review, you do need to let us know, or you can give us one on another podcasting platform that lets us know. But of course, thank you as always. Courtney, I want to start, if I may, with Aston Martin. And from what I gathered, from what we saw with Aston Martin, there seems to be a bit of a regularity now in terms of how they go about their business of car launches. This is a team that quite often aren't afraid to show what is really under the hood of their car. Whether or not that's the full car that comes out in testing and in the race, we know that Aston Martin like bringing upgrades as soon as they possibly can. They are quite aggressive with their development. But as I said, this is a team that, we know what we're going to get from them. You get the car draped in the Union Jack covers before that eventually comes off. There's the green lighting, a very Aston Martin vibe. Lawrence Stroll has his address of the F1 fans in the same way that a political leader might address the nation at an important time, a few that we may have been subject to wherever you are around the world in recent times. We know what we're getting from Aston Martin. And I must say, Courtney, from what I saw when the car was finally revealed, it didn't disappoint. It looks visibly stunning, so much better than last year's car. One of the best looking cars on the grid, I must say, and purely and simply because there's not a load of black carbon on there. This is a full, normal looking Aston Martin based on what we expected. What did you make of it all? Did you enjoy the launch?
Yeah, straight to the point. We haven't seen enough of that with these car launches. Straight to the point compared to some of the other teams. But look, we went there before. But yeah, I've been very sort of very buoyant and confident about what Aston Martin could deliver this year. I mean, me potentially getting a forfeit could very much depend on Aston Martin's form this year. So I am hoping that they'll do well. we saw them have a strong end to 2023, and usually the form book would suggest if you have a strong end to one season, if there isn't a big regulation change, you should be carrying that into the following season. They've bought some personnel in from Red Bull, and that's always a good thing. And with the Fernando Alonso situation, the way they left Alpine so dramatically, he must know something that we don't. So Aston Martin are definitely a team we need to be keeping an eye on this year.
It's all about the big project, isn't it? I mean, Aston Martin will be moving into their new factory very, very soon. It's going to be happening around about May, I think, in 2023. The new simulator and wind tunnel will be ready later on in the year. So, of course, they'll be able to extract the full benefits of that for their 2024 car. Eventually, transitioning into that big team that they want to become, probably likely by the new engine regs in 2026. So that's the overall goal. And, Aston Martin have got to deal with this transition in the meantime. In the short term, they've got to produce a decent car, which is going to propel them as being the kings of the midfield, which I'm pretty certain is what their targets are going to be at the least for 2023. Based on what we've heard and based on what we've seen so far, Courtney, at the very least, it does seem like they're on the right track. Considering that they started 2022 on the back foot, they went wrong in terms of concept on ground effect. Granted, the new technical director, Dan Fallows, didn't really have any influence on the 2022 car, but as we saw upgrades go on to that car throughout the 2022 season and what we've seen for the 2023 car, this definitely is now the first proper car that Dan Fallows, the technical director, has had to oversee and work on at the team.
Yeah, absolutely. This should be the season where we start seeing, the improvements at Aston Martin. I don't want to repeat myself too much, but we started to see this Aston Martin project begin to bear fruit at the back end of last season. I was really impressed with how the team improved. I honestly thought that come mid-season, Aston Martin were just gonna do something similar to what we saw with Alfa Romeo, but no, I think they wanted to make a slight statement of intent, and we saw that. And with the acquisition of Fernando Alonso, a guy who sort of needed a bit of a rejuvenation, and it's a big risk for him. And I just feel that he left the team that finished the best of the rest last season, also have ambitions of their own. So again, something has been said for him, for him to make that move, because Fernando Alonso's pride is very, very much on the line this season. So he's going to be hoping for a lot from this Aston Martin team. And I'm just a humble farmhand who talks about Formula One, but I just feel that this is a team to look out for.
Yeah, speaking of Fernando Alonso, as he often does, he's not afraid to speak his mind and place the odd dig at some of his former employers and opposition. I mean, they asked about what he felt regarding Aston Martin's ambitions, and basically he went along the lines of saying that Aston Martin, the team, is not satisfied with fourth, third, or even second place. It's different from other teams that I've joined that have done well in the past, but finished fourth and are happy to be fourth. No secrets for guessing that he's kind of throwing a bit of shade at Alpine, but there's a lot that can be said for Fernando Alonso's ambition, and it was a huge shock to many of us that he chose to join Aston Martin at a time where Alpine were really finding their feet. They looked like the kings in the midfield, the team most likely to challenge the top three in Red Bull, Ferrari and Mercedes going forward. Taking that gamble going to Aston Martin, and look, we're talking this up already without even having seen the car on track. It could turn up as it did last year when we all thought it would do well and then absolutely flop. And then they're on the back foot and playing catch up again. But based on what we've seen so far, Courtney, I don't want to be overconfident for them, but I would be so surprised if we end up getting a repeat of 2022. It does seem that Aston Martin, based on what we saw from this car so far, there's a lot of Red Bull influence in this. There's a lot of Mercedes influence. If you look at the front of the car as well, something I was a bit surprised to see and notice, but it's there. And given how they claim they're going to be quite aggressive on development in the early races, this car may not be the car that turns up to Bahrain. So it does seem that Aston Martin, at the very least, if they're not fast out of the blocks, it won't take long for them to catch up at all.
Yeah, I think they've got the concept again, following on from last season. They've definitely got something to build on, and completely agree with what you're saying. I expect to see an aggressive development from the team, and I'm assuming they're definitely aiming to be best of the rest. I expect them to be in a battle with another team that we'll be discussing later on. But yeah, I think that the pieces of the jigsaw are starting to come together for this team, and it is that jigsaw that Fernando Alonso has joined that's been sold to him. So it's really intriguing. Aston Martin are definitely one of the teams that I'm most intrigued to see how they get on this year. Usually, Aston Martin have been typical midfield team, but there's definitely something building there. You can really sense it.
Yeah, it almost seems an inevitability. And I've said this on previous shows. People say what they want to say about Lawrence Stroll, but in terms of being an F1 boss and what he's invested into the sport and what he's brought to a team like Aston Martin, he is the team owner that F1 would love to have across the grid. Not necessarily clone him and make 10 Lawrence Strolls all throughout every team in F1, but all the teams that have aspirations to try and move to the front rather than the ones that, with all due respect, would rather just survive in F1, reap the benefits of the financial rewards that today's F1 would grant you for being a regular team, and go beyond that and actually try to achieve something bigger than that. And they seem to be going the right way about it, and I can't see this not working out for them. There seems an inevitability about it that he's going to propel this team and do everything he can, and as a result that creates its own pressures. There will be a schedule. I'm sure there's a lot of patience there, but there will come a time, and I think this kind of ties into my observation of Aston Martin from last year and what they need to improve, is that if the whole is not the sum of its parts, and by that I mean everything coming together, all the right pieces go on the car, the drivers putting in their performances, the designers doing what they need to do to take this team to the top, that is going to be a problem for Aston Martin. And I would say that's the one thing I would say they need to work on this year. Be a sharper team in that midfield pack. Every single thing that goes on that car has to work. The drivers have to do their job. Overall, the team has to handle that overwhelming pressure and make tangible steps forward. And if they're not kings in the midfield by the end of the season, I would say they'd probably consider that a failure.
Absolutely, the pressure will be building if they come out the block slowly, or even towards mid-season. The pressure is going to build because a lot of money has been and will continue to be invested in this team with the sole goal of becoming at least a race-winning car. I think that is the medium-term ambition of this team. You're not just gonna, if you're coming into a team and you're throwing a new wind tunnel, completely new facilities, probably buying one of the most expensive drivers on the grid, I imagine. I don't know Fernando Alonso's wages. I'm no specialist, but I'm assuming he wasn't cheap to buy. Putting all these things together, they're gonna want to be seeing results soon. So this is the season where if things don't turn out the way they want it to, the pressure will be starting to build within the team.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an ambitious bunch, and the sky seems to be the limit for them. So we'll have to see how high they can climb in 2023. Let's move on from one team that have huge aspirations and seem very positive about their expectations for 2023 to a team that seemed rather somber about their own. And I'll be honest with you, Courtney, I hate to say this because I have a lot of respect and fondness for McLaren, but I can't quite remember a time in modern F1 where I've seen a car launch that was so downbeat and, very, not negative, but the word Andrea Stella, the new team principal they used, was realistic about their expectations. Now, of course, we can say expectations are realistic and they're always relative depending on who you ask and the situation they're in. But for a team that was really nipping at the heels of Alpine for being kings in the midfield and probably had no right to be in that position, but, there were a lot of factors at play there. They certainly did the best with what they had. You'd hope that McLaren would be that team to make that next step forward into the upper echelons of the grid in the same way Ferrari did a couple of years ago. And of course, the comparisons between the two setups are almost like chalk and cheese in that regard. But I was a little bit concerned by a few things. One, obviously, the downbeat atmosphere, the fact that the team were quite often playing it down. Technical director James Key wasn't even there either. And there wasn't an explanation for his absence. Of course, we might get one in due course. And the car looked really similar to last season's one. It wasn't a lot of changes. Now, of course, that may come a bit later on, but all of it just gave me the impression that this could be a very difficult period for McLaren in the opening rounds of the 2023 championship, as it was in 2022.
Yeah, I'm very bemused by the situation at McLaren because over the last few seasons, it's been looking like they're actually building something. Ever since Zach Brown kind of took over, we saw through the Carlos Sainz, Lando Norris era, it seemed like they're really building something. And the way they're going with the team, like with the they got some big name sponsors. I know F1 isn't all about sponsors, but they got some big name sponsors in. They've got two young drivers who could, turn out to be two of the best in the coming years. They seem to be appealing to a younger audience, when they got Vic in from the Sidemen. I thought that's a really good thing to do that will appeal to a younger audience, because we've seen the friendship between Lando with Josh and Vic, which is nice to see. But again, it's that sort of youthful optimism that's very much needed at McLaren. And it's that kind of energy that the team need, but they're not utilizing it. It does seem that McLaren seem to be happy to survive the next few years and have a long-term goal. But a team of McLaren size, let's not forget they're one of the most successful teams in Formula One history. And I don't know, it seems that ever since the 2014 regulations came in and Mercedes took charge, it seems that McLaren have never really recovered from that. And if they want to hold on to somebody as talented as Lando Norris moving forward, they're going to have to show some more ambition.
Yeah, I mean, it says a lot. I mean, we questioned what was going on at McLaren when Andrea Seidel moved on to be the head of the Audi project at Alfa Romeo in the interim for the next few years. And, there's obviously an exciting project going on at McLaren. Why would he jump that to go to the other? I mean, I know a lot of people argue the case that, this is a project that's closer to Andreas's heart. It's felt a bit more like home for him. So it's an understandable change. But even then, a lot of people were talking about this as potentially a step down for him. It was more of a romantic decision rather than a performance-based one, if you like. And McLaren would go on fine. They'd have a new team leader in Andrea Stella, and they would carry on and just go to bigger and better things. But as I said, based on what we've heard, I mean, I'll read you a quote from Andrea Stella just to sort of, for those that didn't see the launch, sort of exemplify what we're talking about here. And he was saying that whilst we're happy with the development of the car in most areas, there's some areas in which we realise some really strong direction a little too late. I just invoke realism. Normally, you need to be totally happy and totally at the top of what you can do to achieve your targets. And, if someone's saying that, there's a thing with these car launches that everybody, with some degrees, some more than others, talk up their chances for 2023. Whether they meet those ambitions or not is obviously a different thing. It's sport. Not everybody can be successful unless everybody said we're going to finish in the position that we end up finishing in. Of course, that's possible, but who's honestly going to do that? When someone comes out and says that they have to be realistic about where they were based on how well McLaren did last year or recovered last year, that would worry me. Hearing that as a McLaren fan, that would really worry me a lot. And based on what happened last season where they were playing catch up, it could be another difficult season for them. I mean, we can throw the usual caveats here, Courtney. They haven't had their new wind tunnel and simulator yet. They're still using the old wind tunnel in Cologne that Toyota let them use. And those won't be available till late 2023. So at the very earliest, the 2024 car will have some level of impact from that. The 2025 car will be the first proper car that will be derived using that equipment. It just seems to be more and more excuses with McLaren. And the issue with that is whilst there's a long-term project there, they have a driver in Lando Norris who I think for argument's sake could be considered the next hot prospect in F1 that all the big teams are going to be looking at. And last season the season before, he signed a long-term deal with McLaren. And they decided to back him instead of backing Daniel Ricciardo, who obviously we can talk about a little bit later on as to why that may have fell through for him. But if you want to keep someone like Lando Norris in your team, when all the big teams are going to be keeping an eye on him for a potential opportunity to take him into their fold if one comes, McLaren have to produce a car that is not only going to be one he can get the most out of, but also one that's going to allow him to challenge the upper echelons of the grid in a position where we all feel he should be. So there's going to be some real pressure for McLaren to deliver something if they're not able to do that in the short term.
Yeah, I think they're running out of time. I predict in all my wisdom that Lando Norris will leave McLaren unless they start producing something special. Lando Norris will leave McLaren when Lewis retires, because when Lewis retires, there's either going to be a seat available at Mercedes, or there's going to be a big team driver merry-go-round, and Lando Norris will be a part of that, whether he joins Red Bull, Ferrari, Mercedes, or maybe another team that are showing a lot more ambition, like Audi. Let's not forget Audi, Aston Martin. We just discussed Aston Martin. There just seems to be a lot more team. There seems to be a lot of teams that are showing much more ambition compared to McLaren. I'm always gonna have a soft spot for McLaren, because of the Senna Prost years, Hakkinen. I love McLaren Raikkonen more than any other version of Raikkonen, which might sound a bit strange, but I thought he was amazing in McLaren, and obviously the Lewis Hamilton era, Jenson Button. I'm always gonna have a soft spot for that team, and I just worry if they don't back up their ideas soon, they could start finding themselves falling back and losing that lost ground. And I was going to ask you something actually, Adam, before coming on. I was thinking about it randomly the other day. Why don't McLaren think about start developing their own engines? Because I do feel that the engine partnerships have been one of the issues that have sort of held the team back. Why aren't they looking at the way that Red Bull operating, the way that Audi are operating, and take a leaf out of their book?
It's probably something that crossed their mind. I don't know if they have the infrastructure for that. I mean, even in McLaren's heyday, they were always a customer team. They've never been an out-and-out, fully works team. And, given the current situation with Red Bull and Ford now and leaving Honda a little bit in the mud in this regard, there have been initial talks between McLaren and Honda to sort of bring them back as an engine supplier for maybe 2026 or maybe even earlier than that, given how good that Honda power unit was. There's a lot of legal stuff, I suppose, they'd have to negotiate with Red Bull to sort that all out. But I think whilst there's a lot of logic in what you're saying, Courtney, I think it's just not feasible financially for McLaren to do that. And I think Zach Brown will probably be the first person to say, look, we know how much money is spent on developing and producing these engines. If you are a works team, let alone the amount of money you'd have to invest in trying to do that yourself. And Red Bull have taken the plunge on that, but they've had a lot of resource available to them in the interim through Honda, and now obviously going to take that on with Red Bull powertrains with all the people they've brought in that transition period, and they've been successful throughout that. I just don't think McLaren could start that right now. Actually, no, I know they couldn't start that right now, and by 2026. They'd be lucky to have it all together by 2030, by which time so much could change in the next 7 or 8 years. By that time, it could almost be redundant. So I think for all the right reasons, I think what they're trying to do with Honda, if that comes through, is probably the most sensible decision, or stick with Mercedes again. So, yeah, we'll have to wait and see on that one. I know the good news for McLaren is that there will be some significant upgrades brought to this car. It's rumoured it's going to be Baku, although Andrea Stella said it might be a bit later than that, so we'll have to wait and see. This is a car, most importantly, Courtney, that has struggled to produce consistent downforce. That's something that Lando Norris complained a lot about. It probably also explains why Daniel Ricciardo was not able to extract the most out of this car, because of its peaky downforce nature from last season, even the year before that. You really need to have that special feel as a driver in order to get the most out of it. Lando obviously showed that he could have that, and he's obviously a very gifted talent. Ricciardo, a very talented driver in his own right, was made to look absolutely rubbish in a car that perhaps he was always doomed to fail in because it just never suited his strengths. So, with Piastri coming in, that's something they're going to have to consider, that Oscar Piastri is going to arguably have to be on that level like Lando in order to get the most out of the car.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think the McLaren, the way that it was designed last season, very much highlighted the strengths and the weaknesses of their drivers. So you're right, Piastri could be under the spotlight sooner rather than later.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I suppose the positive that we can take from this is the car looked pretty cool. And it was a nice launch. Even though it wasn't very upbeat and it was a bit pessimistic, the car looked pretty good. So, yeah, we can be happy for McLaren in that regard. Let's move on to Ferrari now. And Courtney, look, biases aside, I'm just going to go out and say it. Best car launch I've seen in a long, long time. Normally, we get the usual parade with Ferrari and the presentation, everything else. I know last year was a little bit tepid, but I think, because of the pandemic and other stuff like that still going on, I think they wanted to be safe rather than sorry on that one. but it was a lot more like Ferrari. They had it at Fiorano, they had a grandstand set up at the circuit to have some fans and people working at the team, all dressed in red except for one person who decided to wear yellow, I think it was, who obviously didn't get the memo. Sang the Italian national anthem, talked to Fred Vasseur, we heard the car engine, we saw pictures of the car, we didn't see the actual car on display, but then the big surprise came. Ferrari doing a live shakedown of their new car on track with Charles Leclerc and Carlos Sainz. And I'm just going to go out there and say it, Corny. I thought that was absolutely phenomenal. The car looked great. It looked fast, although, you know, the usual caveats apply because it was only 15 kilometers of running. But I mean, what a show. I'm still geeking out over it, unless you couldn't tell already.
No, they definitely put some of the other teams to shame, and I'm glad that they got the fans involved because, no offense, Adam, but I feel that Ferrari fans have gone through more suffering compared to most of the other teams' fan bases combined. So I'm glad the fans got a little something back. And I'm hoping that this is a sign of confidence from Ferrari, because if they felt a little bit unsure about this car, I don't think they'd be too keen to sort of put on such a show. Even though we did see that famous show in 2020 and the car was awful, I'm hoping that they've learned from that and they're taking a new approach. And they also seem to focus on, you know, the present and the future rather than the past, because Ferrari have focused too much on the past. It's been over 15 years since they've won a championship. And not only for Ferrari fans in general, but for F1 in general, I just want to have some faith in Ferrari, because it just seems that it's either Mercedes or Red Bull at the moment that run away with it. And Ferrari are the team that, if we're going to have a really entertaining championship battle this year, Ferrari are going to be the team that are going to offer us that.
Yeah, I think so too. They seem the most likely right now to be able to challenge Red Bull. Of course, you know, Mercedes will be there too, but Ferrari have the biggest base to work on in terms of a challenge to Red Bull. Based on the noises we've been hearing from Ferrari all winter long, and again, we have to be very careful with how we take the information that we get from sources in Italy and sources close to Ferrari, because in some years gone by, in the past, Ferrari have been very confident about their expectations and then have come woefully short. Last season, it felt a little bit like that, but of course, they surprised everybody with a 1-2 in Bahrain, and for half a season, they looked a genuine championship challenger. This season could be that final stepping stone that they need to overcome in terms of becoming a genuine title contender. Based on the noises we've heard, with the usual caveats, they've been very happy with what they've done over the winter. It seems that they've ticked all the boxes, according to Fred Vasseur, at least, and people at Ferrari, that they have addressed some big issues there. The engine reliability, obviously one thing that I think we'll both agree, that's a big one. Yeah. They lost a lot of results, and they also had to turn the engine down after the double retirement in Baku, which obviously we've been hearing cost them as much as 0.2 of a second per lap.
It does sound about right.
It does sound about right. And I think this is something that has been misconstrued a bit, because obviously the engine regulations for this, you know, rendition of engine regs prevents improvements being made to the engine for performance. However, if you can free up some performance through reliability improvements, which is what Ferrari have done here, this is where they've gained back that performance. It's not performance that they found that wasn't already there or unlocked. This is performance that they had to sacrifice in order to finish races. They've now found methods, you know, in their own words, that have allowed them to, you know, extract that extra performance again, and hopefully will serve them well. Time will certainly tell if they found those fixes.
I think this is the element you've just mentioned is the part that gives me the most optimism about a championship battle this year, because it's definitely more so with Ferrari, but I think there was an element of that with Mercedes last season as well, where they chose reliability over raw pace, whereas Red Bull seemed to have got everything figured out more sooner compared to their competitors, which obviously contributed towards the large gap that they had, because I think sometimes we forget how much of a role that engine played in the dominance at Red Bull. Nothing against Adrian Newey. I mean, I still believe he's the best car designer that F1 has ever seen. But the engine power did definitely contribute to the extent of Red Bull's dominance. And if Ferrari in particular, Mercedes have sorted out the issues that have slowed down their straight line speed, that should really close things up. And look, let's be honest, more equal straight line speed, we'll see more battles between the drivers on the grid. And this is what we've been waiting for such a long time. So let's hope that Ferrari in particular has sorted that out.
Yeah, I mean, not to mention other things as well. The car itself according to Enrico Gardile, the head of the technical department there, he mentioned that this is a car that's a complete redesign, not just an evolution on last year's car, which is obviously impressive for different reasons. And, Ferrari have stuck to that core concept that they've gone. They've not gone down the Red Bull route or even the Mercedes route, if you like. They've stuck to what they've done. And I think it's a nicer looking car. I'm not a fan of the overall livery. I think there are certain parts of it, like the Ferrari logo, the old Ferrari logo on the rear wing. I think that's a lovely touch. I like what they've done with the numbers now, because Charles Leclerc's got the white numbers, Carlos Sainz got the black ones. So that's a nice way to tell the difference, because I think last year they kind of played around with that. The carbon elements on the car that they haven't painted, obviously to try and save weight, to get down to their target weight limit. That's obviously important. So, the drivers themselves were saying that there's some, much improved balance adjustments, and the sim work seems to be better correlated with this new car. Of course, Ferrari have recently had a new sim themselves, so obviously there's a lot of work needs to be done there. So all the things that Ferrari looked like they needed to address in the winter, according to them, it looks like they have done, which is a good thing if it does come true. Coming to the season ahead for Ferrari, Courtney, there are other issues at play. Fred Vasseur obviously stepping in after Mattia Binotto leaving the team, of course, before he was pushed. But it does feel that there's still a lot more to address. Driver mistakes, strategy errors, operational mistakes within the team. Fred Vasseur has been very open and honest about those things, in addition to the reliability issues Ferrari suffered. That's going to be key for this season. If they are going to beat Red Bull, and possibly Mercedes as well if they're involved, they're going to have to address all those small factors that make such a huge difference in a championship fight.
I think the main thing, I absolutely agree about the strategy. I think Ferrari need to stop being the clowns of the grid, because they've had the potential for years to be world champions, and like in a sense they're responsible for their own downfall most of the time. But I look at Charles Leclerc as well, Adam, to be honest, and we've been Charles Leclerc fanboys for a very long time. We all know he has the makings of being a multiple world champion. But if he wants to compete with Max Verstappen and potentially Lewis Hamilton or even George Russell as well, he has to take it to that next level. We know he has it in him, but he needs to iron out the creases in his driving style. I've probably said this many times in many podcasts before, but it is the one thing about Charles Leclerc that he's missing. We know that Ferrari could possibly give him the car this year, but he needs to take, I'd say, his mental game to that next level, because you're coming up against the likes of Max Verstappen and Lewis Hamilton. We saw what happened in 2021. Charles Leclerc could be getting thrusted right in the middle of that mayhem. So he's going to need to show some mental resilience that I don't think we've seen yet from him consistently enough to be a world champion. But I do feel he can do it. It's just a case whether he can do it this season if Ferrari give him the car.
Yeah. And as I said, you have the normal gains that you make over the winter, assuming that Ferrari and Red Bull do exactly the same in terms of what performance they've gained from 2023 past 2022. If Ferrari have, at the very least, addressed its Sunday performance issues and reliability and the performance that they would have gained from that, and the tyre wear issues that they suffered with last season, all of a sudden, they're neck and neck again. And then we'll get the championship fight that we wanted last year, but unfortunately for obvious reasons we weren't able to get, so we'll have to wait and see. Moving on to Mercedes, the W14, a car that a lot of people would have been very interested to see, not only because of the concept, but also because of the livery. And I gotta say, Courtney, I didn't expect Mercedes to do this, but they are back to black. And my, oh my, does it look fantastic. Honestly, best looking car on the grid, in my opinion.
Yeah, no, she is. The W14 is a beauty. I also like the fact that they didn't sugarcoat the fact that the main reason why they've done it is to cut the weight that comes with the paint job. So I'm glad they're honest about that. Obviously, I have mixed views on it, because the black livery brings back some good memories, particularly with the 2020 car, but the the hide pod concept, the fact they're sticking with it, it worries me. Maybe, obviously, Mercedes, look, they've come up with so many good innovations in the past. I always have faith in the team to deliver. And there's still so many features of the W13 on that car, and it makes me worry. Look, we know that they developed a race-winning car by the end of the season. I am very optimistic that Mercedes will be in that battle with Ferrari and Red Bull to some extent. To extent, obviously, we don't know yet.
Well, it's
There's just a part
interesting.
of me.
Yeah.
There is just a part of
Hmm.
me. I'm still seeing a lot of the W13 in that car, and it is a concern for me personally.
Well, it is interesting because, when they asked Toto Wolff about this and technical director Mike Elliott for his thoughts on this car, whilst they were aware that there were issues with this concept, they felt that the side pods were not the fundamental flaw in it. It was more a symptom than a cause in this regard. Now, in terms of the hide pod concept, whilst we may see Mercedes run that in testing and maybe the first race or two, Toto Wolff did allude at the possibility that this may only be temporary. He said explicitly in the launch, and I'll quote his word in here, you could well see some development with upgrades and the side pods will change. Not very soon, but we are looking at solutions. And I think this is kind of backed up, Courtney, by the fact that no other team has adopted these side pods. Now, of course, we all suspected, as Gunther Steiner said last year, Mattia Binotto as well, that it was something that they had looked at when they were developing their 2022 cars before they were revealed last year. But they felt that it was a concept that had potential and merit, but ultimately there were better solutions out there. And they obviously went different ways. And we're not going to compare Mercedes to Haas, although at some races they were racing each other. Ferrari obviously is a more realistic benchmark for where Mercedes want to be. And I think based on what we saw last season, despite a few tracks where Mercedes had a slight advantage, obviously, and the Red Bull as well, if you like, that hide pod concept, whilst it's probably not a terrible thing, there obviously is some inherent issues with Mercedes that they've obviously grown to understand throughout last season, where they may feel that's not the best way to go. And as I said, I think it's something that has been overstated in how significant it is. I think there are other factors at play with this car that Mercedes have obviously understood a lot better now that they are keen to address rather than just making the side pods go. I mean, if they come out with Ferrari-style side pods or Red Bull-style side pods, which is probably more likely, I'm not expecting them to return to the front. But it could open more opportunities for them going forward when they want to develop this concept.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Look, it's one thing like me having concerns about the hide pod, but at the same time, if they were to do what the majority of the good have done and copied the Red Bull side pods, you are automatically at a disadvantage to the Red Bull because the Red Bull are going to come out with a more refined version of those side pods this season. So in that sense, if Mercedes were to copy the Red Bull side pods, they would be behind in that category of that car. And also, let's not forget that all these cars behave differently, and all these compartments of these cars need to react to each other to get the perfect performance on the car. Those side pods might not even work on the Mercedes. These guys get paid a lot of money, and they've got top class qualifications. These are some of the greatest engineers that that the world has. So they obviously know a lot more than we do. But the hide pod for me is going to be like it's probably going to be one of the biggest talking points of this Mercedes this year. But I am optimistic about this Mercedes. I can't lie.
Yeah, and so are the team too. I think they probably feel that they've done relatively well over the winter. Again, it's always hard to tell with Mercedes because I think Toto Wolff during that launch was very tempted to try and avoid using the word eventually because it was almost a sense of, well, eventually we will catch them. They are aware that they're going to play catch-up. They probably didn't have the winter that they would have wanted, or perhaps in their view, compared to what Ferrari had. But again, we'll have to wait and see what happens on the track, because Ferrari tend to overstate their performance more often than not. Mercedes tend to underplay it. So, maybe they'll meet in the middle somewhere in terms of where they really are. But they are aware fully that they will expect to play catch-up. Based on what we saw in terms of the development trajectory last season, when Mercedes finally were able to identify, isolate their weaknesses and work on them, the most important of which was eradicating the porpoising issue, they all of a sudden became a threat. The weight issue was also another thing which Toto Wolff mentioned as well, that it wasn't just about getting down to the minimum weight, but the target weight, which would imply that they're actually trying to go below the 798 kilo weight to give them a few extra kilos to play around with ballast so that they could meet that weight and help with performance as well. So those are all good things for Mercedes. If they can eradicate the porpoising issue and focus on the strengths of their car and make sure they correlate with what they saw in the simulations, which is something they struggled heavily last season, there's absolutely no reason why Mercedes at some point this season could be in the fight with Red Bull and Ferrari. It may not be the first race, it may be halfway through the season, or it could happen straight away. But it does feel like Mercedes are starting to get on the right track again. Where they are compared to the other two, who obviously started on better bases than they did going into 2023, we'll have to wait and see how that all turns out for them.
I completely agree with everything you're saying there, but I think another thing that we need to raise is the driver lineup. I personally believe that they got the best lineup on the grid. So even if Mercedes develop a car that's close to the Ferrari and the Red Bull, I think they're going to be causing trouble for the team. We saw it. We saw it in Brazil. The moment the Mercedes had a car that was able to compete, we saw both George and Lewis give Max Verstappen a run for his money. I'm sure we'll be seeing Max Verstappen fans popping up in the comments saying Lewis Hamilton fanboy, da 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 da. But I think we can all agree that if anybody's going to challenge Max Verstappen, it was probably most likely to be Lewis Hamilton. And I'm also looking forward to seeing more of George Russell against Max Verstappen, because we saw that battle in Spain that got quite tasty last year. And I want to be seeing George compete with the best, because we know George has the potential. So if Mercedes develop the car, not only is he going to be coming against Max Verstappen and Leclerc, he's going to be coming up against his teammate Lewis Hamilton. So if these teams all get their act together, we could be in for a really tasty season. And look, that's why we do this podcast. We don't only have our favourite teams. We love the sport. We want to be seeing some great action. So I'm hoping that both, not only Mercedes, but also Ferrari are going to catch up with Red Bull, because that's what the sport needs right now.
Yeah, we certainly hope so. And we'll have to wait and see how it all pans out. The one hope I have for Mercedes is that they don't end up having another season where they're troubleshooting this car for half the season like they did last year. Because if they are, they're not going to get anywhere near Ferrari and Red Bull in 2023. And if anything, not that we see much of the Red Bull, but if Red Bull have improved their car to the same standard in which Ferrari claim that they have, Mercedes obviously going to have to do something a little bit better than what they've done in order to get on a level footing, because those two teams aren't going to be standing still. So Mercedes cannot afford to have the first half of 2023 go as it did in 2022. It's not going to happen for them if that's what happens. We'll have to wait and see. Stunning car. I like the numbers, the numbering on the car, obviously with the neon yellow for Sir Lewis. Not a big fan of George's one. Would have been nice to have the neon blue instead of the green, but maybe
I was confused by that as well. Maybe they'll change it.
I hope they do. And it kind of matches up with the Petronas stuff as well. So
exactly.
Yeah, maybe we'll see.
I do feel that if Mercedes develop a good car, I do feel that the black Merc and the fluorescent yellow Lewis helmet could become quite iconic. So again, it's another reason why I want to see, because that color mashup is amazing. So it needs to be fast. It looks fast. Please be fast. Come on.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen a lot this season already, and all the other teams, with the exception of Red Bull, to which we haven't really seen what their proper car is going to look like yet, although we imagine the livery is going to be rather consistent. It's very much carbon influenced in terms of stripping away as much paint as possible, which, kind of aligned with Mercedes' values in that regard, where they used to strip paint away and then it'd be like the silver arrows, obviously why they got their name for that. They've kind of done the same here with the black Mercedes. So, and it's something they acknowledged as well. So it's a very nice touch for that nostalgia element too. But they've really made the car look really, really good. I don't think it was as good as the 2020 car, but for obvious reasons, they were able to do a bit more with that in terms of the design, rather than this one where they've had to strip as much weight as they possibly can. Let's move on to the final one, Courtney, the Alpine A523, the final car to show itself to the Formula One world for 2023. Gotta say, car looks good. Not the real car in person. During the launch in London on Thursday evening, we saw two show cars. We saw the one with the normal blue livery and one with the pink livery that they're going to run at the first few races of the season, same way that they did in 2022 as part of their partnership with BWT. I'll be honest, Courtney, I mean, the car looks good. It weren't as good as last year's. I think this is a theme with some of these cars, and I've said this a few times already. I think because of the black on some of these cars caused by and it's carbon black, I should specify, not just black paint. It doesn't really go with some of these cars, but I think when you get to a point where, well, we don't care as long as the car is fast. We don't want to have the prettiest car on the grid if it's going to be slow. So, despite that, and looking at the renders that I saw, I've got to say I liked what I saw of Alpine. There looks like a lot of progress has been made with them, and as I said, I made a prediction already on this, but it didn't surprise me that they do look like the team most likely to nip at the heels of the top three, if anybody, so far.
They've definitely been vocal about that. I was surprised. They're talking about challenging the front three. It'd be interesting to see if they can. But look, I like the ambition. I feel that what you're doing in this sport, if you don't aim to be the best, I just you think about the amount of money these teams invest. Like, why are you just coming in to make up the numbers? Like, you should be aiming to be champions, and I like that mindset. With the livery itself, I much preferred the pink livery. I think it's always been a part of the sort of the F1 fan base is always warm to the pink cars, obviously sort of during a Racing Point era. But yeah, I'm hoping that they're in the mix. I do expect them to be in a battle with um Aston Martin and perhaps McLaren, which I think also adds a new dynamic. Because if you think about it, you had Fernando Alonso abruptly leave them to go to Aston Martin. And then they went to their youth driver, Oscar Piastri, who pretty much rejected them to go to McLaren. So I do feel that Alpine are going to be particularly motivated to completely whoop the asses of those two said teams. So I think they're coming into the season with a lot of fire in their belly, and also with the driver lineup that they have. I do feel that Alpine are going to be probably, unless there's a championship battle with other teams, I feel the Alpine story could well be the most spicy story of F1 2023.
Yeah, and we'll get into why that is in a moment. But, you were talking about ambition. I think Otmar Zafna pretty much put it plain and clear to everybody that the plan for the year ahead is less DNFs, more points, hopefully some podiums. I certainly hope so, based on my predictions. A lot closer to third and further away from fifth than we were in 2022. And, I looked at the table, Courtney, and they were only 14 points ahead of McLaren at the end of last season, who finished fifth. Alpine should have been well clear of McLaren in the championship, but as it were, it was quite close. They were 342 points off Mercedes in third, so that is a gulf to make up. Yeah, Owen Wilson couldn't said it better. But if you know, you know. But at the same time, whilst that is a rather ambitious, expectation or target for Alpine by Otmar Zafna, the team principal, it's probably the only realistic one that they can set. Because when you're fourth, and Alpine last season, despite the reliability issues they had with the engine and the water pump issues that plagued Fernando Alonso so often last season, if it weren't for those issues, Corny, they would have been so far ahead of McLaren that they probably would have been in that halfway house position between Mercedes and the top three and everybody else behind them. So for me, I think that's the absolute realistic ambition, most realistic one that they could make, and one that I would be very surprised if they didn't achieve based on what we see so far. Now, of course, reliability is a big issue for Alpine. Like Ferrari, Renault did a lot of work overhauling their engine for 2022, in a lot of ways sacrificing reliability to achieve that immediate performance where they'd only have one small window to actually do it. They could work on reliability later on. As we saw, like Ferrari, there were a lot of reliability issues, although Alpine did stress through Renault that other than that one crazy incident in Singapore where both the V6s failed on the cars, the internal combustion engine was relatively sound. So they've gone away, done a lot of work on reliability. They seem pretty happy with the progress that they've made, like Ferrari have as well. If that is the case, Corny, on top of the aero developments the car's got, that's going to be a good base for them going forward.
No, I completely agree. You need to be going in with this kind of ambition. As I said, I think let's not forget that there are times last season that they were challenging Mercedes. We know that Mercedes are going to take a big step forward, but that's the ambition we need to be seeing. That's the sort of ambition I want to be seeing from McLaren that we were so disappointed about. When we saw McLaren finish best of the rest a couple of years ago, we thought, okay, here we go. Maybe they are going to start challenging the big boys again. So this is the sort of ambition that McLaren need to be showing. And look, there's one part of me that wants to see Alpine challenge. I'm going to be honest. There's a part of me that wants to see Alpine challenge, but for the sake of the preseason predictions, I want to be seeing them languish behind Aston Martin. So that rivalry there between us, Adams, going to be starting. It's not only going to be Ferrari against Mercedes, it's also going to be the Aston Martin Alpine battle. So, yeah, we've got a little bit more to sort of watch this season, mate.
Yeah, and based on how things go, the winners will probably be Red Bull and McLaren and all of that, so neither of us get what we want. But, I'd rather see McLaren do well than Red Bull, to be honest. But, Red Bull fans, apologise, it's not really where my biases or where my allegiances lie, as many people that
Certainly
watch this
not.
show will know of. But, yeah, with Alpine, it is an important one, and I think the biggest dynamic they're going to have to manage this year, other than reliability, is Ocon and Gasly as a partnership. Now, Ocon was asked about this. He had some interesting words to say during the launch. He basically said, to quote, "Obviously you guys like the headlines, but we are both very professional and we're going to work the way we need to be performing. I don't think we'll ever be best friends, but that doesn't matter really, as long as the atmosphere is great inside the team." And, Otmar Szafner was talking about that as well. When they considered Pierre Gasly for the second driver at the team to replace Oscar Piastri as it was at the time, or in this case Fernando Alonso, he mentioned that they had made an informed decision, and that meant talking to the whole team, including Esteban. And Esteban was very supportive, and Pierre was as well, of the overall ambitions to work together. So, from those quotes alone, Courtney, Ocon is very aware that this is something that's going to be brought up quite a lot. It already has been and will continue to do so this season. Pierre Gasly was the same in this regard. Otmar Szafner is aware of the challenge, but in a way it is encouraging that bringing Pierre Gasly into the team involved the approval, if you like, and consultation of Esteban Ocon for it to go through. You could imply that if Ocon didn't give the thumbs up, it wouldn't have happened. So on that alone, that's got to be a positive for Alpine fans already, hasn't it?
I want to agree with you, but it's all well and good saying that before you become teammates and before you launch the car. You're telling me that if they end up in a close championship battle, two French drivers known each other for a long time, you're telling me that things won't get tasty. It's the equivalent of me and you, Adam. If we'd both done karting together for such a long time, we'd want to beat each other more than anyone else. So once you go into that kind of situation, let's see if there's a close performance gap between these two drivers. They're going to come together at some point on track. There's going to be one driver's going to potentially upset the other driver's strategy. We see the usual things that cause inter-team fallouts. Let's see if these words stick when these kind of scenarios occur.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, there's obviously been a lot said about the actual incident that happened between the two of them, and it obviously goes beyond just them. It, extends as far as their families as well. So it's obviously a deep-rooted personal one, despite the fact that they had a great relationship growing up until then. We've never disclosed the details in this, not that we know of the details.
I'll be honest, I don't know what you're talking about.
No, but this is it. This is it. We've never really speculated on this because we don't know. And a lot of people don't know. I suppose you have to be tightly knitted within that. And even then, you see so many rumours online. It's best not to speculate on it. What we do know, however, is that there is a situation at Alpine right now that both drivers will be interested in. And that is the fact that Fernando Alonso, the former leader of that team, the marquee man in that team, has now moved on to, in his opinion, pastures new and better pastures that be. Ocon and Gasly probably won't agree with that. They're both two young French drivers with a rich heritage in karting, great experience together in a French team. It's the dream for them, but only one of them is going to be the number one. Now, whilst we have seen some occasions of Gasly being fiery at the wheel with teammate battles, although not that often, Ocon has a very big history of incidents with teammates, most notably with Sergio Perez, had a few altercations with Fernando Alonso as well during their time Alpine together. Otmar Szafner kind of put it really well when it comes to Ocon, in that he needs to be better, or a better judge of knowing when to race a teammate and how hard, especially as he did with Fernando Alonso. And this is something he said towards the back end of 2022. Courtney, we've already talked about this, but I think we should sign off with this part with Alpine, is that whilst there's a lot of things that could go well for him this season, ultimately, if the drivers are too busy fighting for their own interests to try and be the number one in the team, that could be the defining factor as to whether or not they finish where they hope to be in 4th place and a long way ahead of 5th and closer to the top 3.
100%. Because if they're going to be in a tight battle with Aston Martin, we fully expect Fernando Alonso to be the number 1 driver. We've discussed this so many times during our time running this podcast that if you've got a close battle between teams, but you've got one driver. So I always use the Red Bull example. If there's a close championship battle, you'd expect Max Verstappen to have the advantage in the Drivers' Championship because Sergio Perez is going to be taking a lot less points off Max compared to, let's say, George Russell will from Lewis. So if you have the situation where Alpine are doing that, with the 2 drivers taking points off each other, then Fernando Alonso is going to be laughing at Alpine once again.
Yeah, absolutely. But of course, I think we'll have to leave it there, Courtney. If I can push you, I know we've kind of alluded to what one we like already, but of the 10 cars that we've now seen, biases and allegiances aside as best as we can, do you have a favourite? And also, do you have a least favourite looking car as well? I'm going to push you for that one too.
This is where I'm going to be getting called names. So my favourite is Mercedes. And take a guess what my least favourite is? The Red Bull.
Well, yeah, I suppose because we've only seen the livery, really, we can't really complain about the car. But
exactly.
Yeah,
I'll talk about liveries here.
Yeah, of course. We'll have to wait and see what the real Red Bull is when it finally shows itself. My favourite, yeah, I agree. Mercedes. Ferrari was a very close one. The Alfa Romeo was also stunning. I think when we saw some of the other cars, I think, Aston Martin as well. They deserve a shout. If anything, I could change my mind later on and say, you know what, I like that Aston Martin. I think that looks pretty good as well. But yeah, certainly not to be made there. Least favourite looking car. Oh, it's tough. But I'm not going to say Red Bull because I made this argument about Red Bull in the past where I feel like if they changed the look of their car, I think a lot of people would actually miss it. And I think that's the reason why they like that that homage to Japan and Honda, that livery they did in the Turkish Grand Prix a couple of years ago.
Oh, that was a lovely one.
It was nice, but if you ran that livery all year long, a lot of people would probably get fed up of it because it loses its luster, really, and you start to miss the old Red Bull livery in that regard. But do I have a least favourite? Oh, I'm probably going to hate myself for saying AlphaTauri's got to be, isn't it?
Yeah. That would have been, if it wasn't for the Red Bull having the same livery every year.
Yeah.
In terms of pure aesthetics, it would be the AlphaTauri.
Yeah, absolutely. But guys, that's all we got time for. Let us know what your favourite livery was. If there were any that you didn't like, which ones were your favourites, and which car launches impressed you the most. I mean, you're going to have to go some way to not like what Ferrari did. I mean, we got to see an F1 car, a 2023 car on track. And I think Ferrari just kind of, answered to our prayers, really. We wanted to see some Formula 1 cars on track after the winter break, and Ferrari answered that. So for that alone, Courtney, I think we need to give them both world titles already. We don't even need a championship, do we? Just give it all to Ferrari. But
we'll go that far, mate.
Well, I might, but I'm sure the Tifosi will back me up on that one. But anyway, guys, despite the fact that Ferrari won the car launches, there's plenty of action to go for 2023, and I certainly cannot wait. We're not too far away now from pre-season testing, which is going to be happening at the end of next week. So close. We have got a podcast to talk about the test, and that will be coming in a couple of weeks' time. However, in the meantime, we do have another episode in between, an interview with presenter, broadcaster, and very, very vocal on the social channels in Formula One, Tony Cohen-Brown. Really looking forward to interviewing Tony to get her thoughts on the F1 season and the influence of social media in Formula One and their growing impact on the sport. But guys, as always, make sure to support the channel. Subscribe if you are new. Get us to 1,000 subscribers before the start of the season. We're only 8 away at the point of recording this episode. Please help us out if you're new. Of course, like the video as always, and don't forget to leave us a 5-star review on your favourite podcasting platform. Until next time, please stay safe, take care, and we'll see you in the next episode of the DNF1 F1 podcast. And remember, as always, if you're not first, you're probably DNF1.
See you soon.